CHAPTER XIII GETTING THE BEST OF THE U-BOAT The U-boat commander who sallied forth from the harbor of Wilhelmshaven in the early days of the war had nothing to fear. He was out to murder, not to fight. His prey was always out in the open, while he could kill without exposing more than his eye above water. Not even a sporting chance was allowed his victims, particularly when he chose unarmed merchantmen for his targets. He could come up boldly to the surface and shell a ship into submission. This was cheaper than torpedoing the vessel, because torpedoes are expensive. If the ship were speedy, it might run away, or if the U-boat came up too close to its intended prey, the latter might run it down. That happened occasionally, and it was the only danger that the Herr Commandant had to fear. If a destroyer suddenly appeared, the U-boat could dive into the shelter of the sea. If the water were not deep, it could lie on the bottom for 2 or more days if need be. There was plenty of air in the hull to sustain life for many hours, and then the compressed air used for blowing the ballast tanks could be drawn upon. In the U-boat there were potash cartridges to take up the carbon dioxide, and tanks of pure oxygen to revitalize the air. If the submarine were damaged, it was not necessary for it to come to the surface to effect repairs. There were air locks through which a diver could be let out of the boat. He was fitted with oxygen and potash cartridges, so that he did not need to be connected by an air hose with the boat, but could walk around it freely to mend injured rudders or to clear the propeller of entanglements. Even the small submarines of those early days were capable of taking long voyages. Setting his course at a comfortable pace of 10 knots, the U-boat commander could count on enough fuel to carry him 1,600 miles, and if need be he could slow down to 8 knots and, by using certain of his water ballast tanks for additional oil reservoirs, extend his cruising radius to about 3,000 miles. The big 800-ton U-boats that were built later had a radius of 5,000 miles at an 8-knot speed, and so when the British closed the English Channel with nets and mines, Herr Commandant was not at all perturbed. He could sail around the British Isles if he chose, and make war upon transatlantic shipping. When harbors were walled off with nets, he could remain outside and sink vessels that were leaving or entering them. Submarine chasers. A real menace came when the U-boat commander popped his periscope out of the sea and saw several little motor boats bearing down upon him. They seemed harmless enough, but a moment's inspection showed them to be armed with guns fully as powerful as those he carried. It was useless to discharge a torpedo at so speedy and small a foe. A torpedo has to have a fairly deep covering of water, else its course will be disturbed by surface waves, and the submarine chasers drew so little water that a torpedo would pass harmlessly under them. It was useless for the U-boat commander to come up and fight them with his guns. They would have been upon him before he could do that, and their speed and diminutive size made them very difficult targets to hit. Besides, he dared not risk a duel of shell, for he knew that if the precious inner hull of his boat were punctured, he could not seek refuge under water, and if he could not hide, he was lost. The little armed mosquito craft swarmed about the harbor entrances, ready to dash at any submarine that showed itself. They could travel twice as fast as a submarine when it was submerged, and half again as fast as when it was running on the surface. Submarines had to take to cover when these chasers were about. Herr Commandant did not even dare to take a look around through his periscope, because the streak of foam that trailed in its wake would betray him, and immediately the speedy motor boats would take up the chase. And they had a disagreeable way of dropping bombs, which, even if they did not sink the submarine, might produce such a concussion as to spring its seams. His foes had discovered one of his most serious defects. He was blind under water, and they were making the most of this handicap. Groping along under water by dead reckoning was not any too safe a procedure near land, because he was liable at any moment to crash into an uncharted rock, or maybe into the wreck of some submarine victim. he could not correct his bearings without coming to the surface, and in the black depths of the sea a slight miscalculation might send him to his doom. As was explained in the previous chapter, he had to keep moving because he could not remain suspended under water. He was more helpless than a ship sailing in the densest of fogs. A ship can stop and listen to sound signals, or even to the beating of the surf on the shore, or it can take soundings to locate its position, and yet it is no uncommon occurrence for a ship to run ashore in a fog. How much easier it is for a submarine to lose its bearings when obliged to travel by dead reckoning, particularly in the disconcerting excitement of the chase. To avoid the danger of collision with surface vessels, the commander chose to run at a depth of 65 feet. That was the upper limit of his safety zone. A depth of over 200 feet was his lower limit because, as stated before, the water pressure at that depth would crush his hull, or at least start its seams. If the bottom were smooth and sandy, and not too deep, he could settle gently upon it and wait for darkness to make his escape. But while he lay on a sandy bottom, he was still in danger. Trawlers were sweeping the bottom with nets. He might be discovered, and then, if he did not come up and surrender, a bomb would let in the sea upon him. A hint from nature. While he could not see under water, his adversaries could. They had taken a hint from nature. The fish hawk has no difficulty in spying his submarine prey. Flying high above the water, he can see his victims at a considerable depth, and wait his chance to pounce upon an unwary fish that comes too near the surface. It is said that the British trained seagulls to hunt submarines. Seagulls will follow a ship far out to sea for the sake of feeding on refuse that is thrown overboard. British submarines encouraged the birds to follow them by throwing out bait whenever they came to the surface. Of course the birds could see the submarines even when it was submerged, and if they pursued it they were always rewarded with plenty of food. The gulls drew no fine distinction between Hun and Briton, and so it came that Herr Kommandant often groped his way along in the dark sea, totally oblivious of the fact that he was attended by an escort of feathered folk who kept the British chasers informed of his presence. In this connection it is interesting to note that the British trained sea lions to hunt submarines. The animals were taught at first to swim to a friendly submarine, locating it by the sound of its propellers. They were always rewarded with fish. These sea lions were muzzled so that they could not go fishing on their own account. Then they learned to locate enemy submarines and pointed them out by swimming directly toward them and diving down to them. But there were human eyes as well that spied upon the U-boat. Fast seaplanes patrolled the waters, searching constantly for any trace of submarine. Its form could be vaguely outlined to a depth of from 50 to 75 feet, unless the sea were choppy, and once it was discovered, chasers or trawlers were signaled to destroy it with bombs or to entangle it in nets. Often a submarine could be discovered by a leak in its oil tank, which would leave a telltale trail. Sometimes, when the U-boat itself could not be discerned, there would be slight shimmer such as may be seen above a hot stove, caused by refraction of light in its wake. This was easily recognized by trained observers. Even better aerial patrols were the small dirigibles known as blimps. They were a cross between a balloon and an airplane, for they have the body and the power plant of an airplane, but the planes are replaced by a gas bag. Blimps could cruise leisurely and search the sea thoroughly. They could stop and hover directly over a submarine and drop explosives upon it with great accuracy. And so Herr Kommandant could take no comfort in hiding under a blanket of waves unless the blanket were so thick as to conceal his form completely from the eyes overhead. This made it imperative to leave the shallower waters near shore and push out into the deep sea, where the small chasers could not pursue him. But he could not shake off his pursuers. Stream trawlers were built to ride the heaviest gales, and they took up the chase out into the ocean. There was a decided advantage for the U-boat in moving out to sea. It had a wider field of activity and could more easily escape from its pursuers. But on the other hand, its prey also had an advantage. Out in the open ocean they were not obliged to follow the usual ship lanes, and it was more difficult for a submarine to intercept them. There it took more U-boats to blockade a given area. A game of hide and seek. Then it ceased to be quite so one-sided a game when merchantmen began to carry guns. That made it necessary for the submarine commander to creep up on his victim stealthily and depend upon his torpedoes. He had to get within 1,000 yards of the ship, and preferably within 500 yards, in order to be sure of hitting it. If the ship could travel faster than he could, he had to do this without betraying his presence. But ship captains soon learned that their safety lay in zigzagging. When Herr Kommandant reached the point from which he had planned to attack, he would raise his telescopic periscope out of the water, expecting to see his victim within good torpedo range, only to find it sailing safely on another tack. Again he would have to take observations and make another try, probably with no better luck. It was a game of hide and seek, in which the merchant ship had a good chance of making its escape, particularly when blotches of camouflage paint made it difficult for him to get the range, as described in Chapter 11. Slower ships could be attacked without all this maneuvering, provided the submarine guns outranged those of the ship. And so U-boats were provided with larger and larger guns, which made it possible for them to stand off and pound the merchantmen while out of reach of the vessel's guns. But ships found a way of hiding on the surface of the sea. A vessel would spout forth volumes of dense black smoke, which would obliterate it from view. If the wind was quartering, the ship would change its course and dodge behind the sheltering pall of smoke. Not only was the smoke produced on the vessel itself, but smoke boxes were cast overboard to form a screen behind the vessel. These smoke boxes contained a mixture of coal tar and phosphorus and other chemicals, which would produce incomplete combustion. They were ignited by the rubbing of a phosphorus compound on a priming composition, and then cast adrift to pour out dense volumes of heavy smoke. Behind this screen the ship could dodge and zigzag, and if her speed were greater than that of the submarine, her chances of escape were very good. Another annoyance that Herr Kommandant experienced was when he lifted his periscopic eye above water to find it so smeared with a sticky substance that he could not see. His foes had strewn the water with tar oil that had spread in a thin film over a surface miles in extent. This blinded him at first, but before long he was equipped with a jet for washing off the periscope glass, and that little annoyance was overcome. But the craft most dreaded by the U-boat commander were the destroyers. These light, high-powered, heavy-armed vessels could travel twice as fast as he could on the surface, and 3 times as fast as he could submerged. Shells were invented which would not ricochet from the surface of the sea, but would plow right through the water where they struck and hit the submarines below water level. Death-dealing ash cans. However, it was not shell fire that he dreaded, but the big ash cans loaded with TNT, which were timed to explode far under water, and which would crush his boat or start its seams. It was not necessary for these bombs to hit the U-boat. When they went off, they would send out a wave of pressure that would crush the boat or start its seams, even if it were 100 feet and more from the point of the explosion. Within limits, the deeper the explosion, the wider would its destructive area be. The timing mechanism of some depth bombs consisted merely of a float on the end of a cord. When the bomb was thrown overboard, the float remained on the surface until the cord was pulled out to its full length, when there would be a yank on the firing trigger and the charge would explode. In other depth bombs there was a valve operated by the pressure of the water. When the bomb sank to the depth for which the valve was set, the pressure of the water would force the valve in, exploding a cartridge which set off the charge. So powerful were these depth bombs that the destroyer had to travel at high speed to get out of range of the explosion. Depth bombs were rolled off the stern of the destroyer and also thrown out from the sides of the vessel by means of mortars. Some of the mortars were Y-shaped and held a depth bomb in each arm of the Y. When a blank 3-inch shell was exploded at the base of the gun, both bombs would be hurled from the ship, one to port and the other to starboard. In this way the destroyer would drop the bombs in a pattern of wide area. Herr Kommandant gained a wholesome respect for these terriers of the sea. It was suicide to show himself anywhere near a destroyer. In a moment the speedy boat would be upon him, sowing depth bombs along his course. His chances of escaping through this hail of high explosives were remote indeed. The ships that he was most eager to destroy were either too speedy for him to catch unless they happened to come his way, or else they were herded in large convoys protected by these dreaded destroyers. The convoy proved a most baffling problem for Herr Kommandant. He dared not attack the convoy by daylight. In a fog he might take a chance at picking off one of the ships, but even that was very risky. He could trail the convoy until dusk, and then under cover of darkness draw near enough to discharge a torpedo, but in the daytime he must keep his distance because there were eyes in the sky watching for him. At the van and rear of the convoy there were kite balloons high in the sky, with observers constantly watching for periscopes and for U-boats that might be lurking under the surface. As the destroyers gained in experience, the difficulties of the U-boat attack grew greater and its work grew more and more perilous. The crew grumbled and grew mutinous. The morale of the men was shaken. We can imagine the horror of plunging hurriedly into the depths of the sea and rushing along blindly under the surface, dodging this way and that, while terrific explosions of depth bombs stagger the submarine and threaten to crush it, and there is the constant expectation that the near explosion will tear the thin shell of the U-boat and let in the black, hungry water. The tables were turned. Now, if never before, Herr Kommandant, the hunter, knew what it was like to be hunted. It takes an exceptional man to go through such a harrowing experience with unshattered nerves. On at least one occasion a submarine that was being depth bombed came suddenly to the surface. The hatch flew open and the crew rushed out, holding up their hands and crying, "Kamerad!" The U-boat was uninjured, but the shock of a depth bomb explosion had put the electric lighting system out of commission, and the crew, unnerved by the explosion and terrified by the darkness, had overpowered their officers and brought the boat to the surface. Eyes in the sea. There were other craft that Herr Kommandant had to look out for. His were not the only submarines in the sea. His foes also were possessed of submarines. They could not see under water any better than he could, but they could fight on the surface as well as he, and they could creep up on him even as he crept upon his prey. As a French submarine commander puts it, the U-boats used to enjoy the advantage of remaining themselves invisible while all the surface and aerial craft which were sent in pursuit of them were boldly outlined against the sky and visible to them. This is one of the reasons we used submarines to ambush U-boats. Submarines were also used to accompany the convoys, so that the U-boat commander had to watch not only for the eyes of the ship's lookouts and the eyes in the kite balloons, but also for the periscopic eyes that swam in the sea. Trailing U-boats by sound. The troubles of the submarine commander were multiplying. All over the world inventors were plotting his destruction. As long as we depended upon our eyes to ferret him out, the sea was a safe refuge, provided he dived deep enough. But when we began to use our ears as well, he found himself in a very serious predicament. Although light is badly broken up in its passage through water, sound waves will travel through water much better than in air. The first listening devices used were crude affairs and did not amount to much, particularly when the U-boats muffled their motors and engines so that they were virtually noiseless. But the French invented a very sensitive sound detector. It consisted of a lot of tiny diaphragms set in a big hemisphere. There were two of these hemispheres, one at each side of the boat. When sound waves struck these hemispheres, the diaphragms would respond. At the focus of each hemisphere there was a megaphone receiver. One of these carried the sound to the operator's right ear and the other to his left. He would turn a megaphone around until he found the diaphragm that produced the loudest sound. This gave him the direction of the sound wave. Then the boat would be steered in that direction. He knew that it was aimed properly when the sound coming to his right ear was just as loud as that which came to his left ear. A still better hydrophone was developed by a group of American inventors. The details of this cannot yet be disclosed, but we know that it was adopted at once by our Allies. A very sensitive receiver was used which could detect a U-boat miles away and determine its direction accurately. Under ideal conditions, the range of the device was from 15 to 25 miles, but the average was from 3 to 8 miles. If two or more boats fitted with sound detectors were used, they could determine the position of the U-boat perfectly. One drawback was that the vessel would have to stop so that the noise of its own engines would not disturb the listener, but this was largely overcome by trailing the detector 100 feet or more from the stem of the ship. The sounds were then brought in by an electric cable to the listener in the ship. These sound detectors were placed on Allied submarines as well as surface vessels, and they were actually tried out on balloons and dirigibles, so that they could follow a U-boat after it had submerged too deeply to be followed by sight. Many U-boats were chased to their doom by the aid of the American hydrophone. Figure 21 illustrates a very dramatic chase. The full line shows the course of the U-boat as plotted out by hydrophones, and the broken line the course of the submarine chasers. The dots represent patterns of depth bombs dropped upon the U-boat. Try as he would, the Herr Kommandant could not shake off his pursuers. At one time, as the listeners stopped to take observations, they heard hammering in the U-boat, as if repairs were being made. The motors of the submarine would start and stop, showing clearly that it was disabled. More depth bombs were dropped, and then there was perfect silence, which was soon broken by 25 revolver shots. Evidently the crew, unable to come to the surface, had given up in despair and committed suicide. The Adriatic Sea was an ideal place for the use of the hydrophone. The water there is so deep that submarines dared not rest on the bottom, but had to keep moving, and so they could easily be followed. Across the sea, at the heel of the boot of Italy, a barrage of boats was established. U-boats would come down to this barrage at night, and when within 2 or 3 miles of the boats, dive and pass under them. But when hydrophones were used, that game proved very hazardous. Our listeners could hear them coming when they were miles away. Then they would hear them shift from oil to electric drive and plunge under the surface. Darkness was no protection to the U-boats. The sound detector worked just as well at night as in the daytime, and a group of 3 boats would drop a pattern of bombs that would send the U-boat to the bottom. On one occasion, after an attack, it was evident that the submarine had been seriously injured. Its motors were operating, but something must have gone wrong with its steering gear, or its ballast chambers may have been flooded, because it kept going down, and soon the listeners heard a crunching noise as it was crushed by the tremendous pressure of the water. And so U-boat warfare grew more and more terrible for Herr Kommandant. The depths of the sea were growing even more dangerous than the surface. On every hand he was losing out. He had tried to master the sea without mastering the surface of the sea. But he can never really master who dares not fight out in the open. For a time the German did prevail, but his adversaries were quick to see his deficiencies, and by playing upon these, to rob the terror of the sea of his powers. And as Herr Kommandant looks back at the time when he stepped into the limelight as the most brutal destroyer the world has ever seen, he cannot take much satisfaction in reflecting that the sum total of his efforts was to spread hatred of Germany throughout the world, to summon into the conflict a great nation whose armies turned the tide of victory against his soldiers, and finally to subject his navy, second only to that of Great Britain, to the most humiliating surrender the world has ever seen. Chapter 14. Devil's Eggs. In modern warfare a duel between fixed forts and floating forts is almost certain to end in a draw. Because the former are fixed, they make good targets, while the warship, being able to move about, can dodge the shell that are fired against it. On the other hand, a fort on land can stand a great deal of pounding, and each of its guns must be put out of action individually before it is subdued, while the fort that is afloat runs the risk of being sunk with a few well-directed shots. But fortifications alone will not protect a harbor from a determined enemy. They cannot prevent hostile ships from creeping by them under cover of darkness or a heavy fog. To prevent this, the harbor must be mined, and this must be done in such a way that friendly shipping can be piloted through the mine field, while hostile craft will be sure to strike the mines and be destroyed. The mines may be arranged to be fired by electricity from shore stations, in which case they are anchored at such a depth that ships can sail over them without touching them. If a hostile vessel tried to dash into the harbor, the touch of a button on shore would sink it when it passed over one of the mines. But the success of electrically fired mines would depend upon the seeing. In a heavy fog they would prove no protection. Another way of using electric mines is to have telltale devices which a ship would strike and which would indicate to the operator on shore that a vessel was riding over the mines, and would also let him know over which particular mines it was at the moment passing. No friendly vessel would undertake to enter the harbor in a fog or after dark, and the operator would not hesitate to blow up the invader even if he could not see him. However, the ordinary method of mining a harbor is to lay fields of anchored mines across the channels and entrances to the harbor, sensitive mines that will blow up at the slightest touch of a ship's hull, and leave tortuous passages through the fields for friendly shipping. Of course, pilots have to guide the ships through the passages, and lest enemy spies learn just where the openings are, the mine fields must be shifted now and then. The mines are therefore made so that they can be taken up by friendly minesweepers who know just how to handle them, and planted elsewhere. These are defensive mines, but there are other mines that are not intended to be moved. They are planted in front of enemy harbors to block enemy shipping, and they are made so sensitive or of such design that they will surely explode if tampered with. The mine that does its own sounding. A favorite type of mine used during the war was one which automatically adjusted itself to sink to the desired depth. Submerged mines are more dangerous to the enemy because they cannot be seen and avoided. They should float far enough under the surface to remain hidden, and yet not so deep that a shallow draft ship can pass over them without hitting them. As the sea bottom may be very irregular, it is impossible to tell how long the anchor cable should be without sounding the depth of the water at every point at which a mine is planted. But the automatic anchor takes care of this. Very ingeniously it does its own sounding, and holds the mine down to the depth for which it is set. The mine cable is wound up on a reel in the anchor, and the mine is held fast to the anchor by a latch. The anchor is of box shape or cylindrical form with perforations in it. At first it sinks comparatively slowly, but as it fills with water it goes down faster. Attached to the anchor is a plummet or weight connected by a cord to the latch. The length of this cord determines the depth at which the mine will float. The operation of the mine is shown in Fig. 22. When it is thrown overboard, it immediately turns over so that the buoyant mine floats on the surface. While the anchor is slowly filling and sinking, the plummet runs out. If the mines are to float at a depth of, say, 10 feet, this cord must be 10 feet long. As soon as it runs out of its full length, it springs a latch, releasing the mine. Then the mine cable pays out as the anchor sinks until the plummet strikes bottom. As soon as the plummet cord slackens, a spring-pressed pawl is released and locks the mine cable reel, so that as the anchor continues to sink, it draws the mine down with it until it touches bottom, and as the anchor was 10 feet from the bottom when the plummet touched bottom and locked the reel, the mine must necessarily be dragged down to a depth of 10 feet below the surface. The mine itself, or the devil's egg, as it is called, is usually a big, buoyant sphere of metal filled with TNT, or some other powerful explosive, and projecting from it are a number of very fragile prongs, which, if broken, or even cracked, will set off the mine. There is a safety lever or pin that makes the mine harmless when it is being handled, and this must be withdrawn just before the mine is to be launched. In some mines the prongs are little plungers that are withdrawn into the mine shell and held by a cement which softens after the mine is submerged and lets the plungers spring out. When the plungers are broken, water enters and, coming in contact with certain chemicals, produces enough heat to set off a cartridge which fires the mine. Picking infernal machines out of the sea. The enemy mine fields are often located by seaplanes, and then minesweepers had to undertake the extremely hazardous task of raising the mines or destroying them. If they were of the offensive type, it was much better to destroy them. But occasionally, when conditions permitted, minesweepers undertook to raise the mines and reclaim them for future use against the enemy. The work of seizing a mine and making it fast to the hoisting cable of the minesweeper was usually done from a small rowboat. Raising the first mine was always the most perilous undertaking, because no one knew just what type of mine it was and how to handle it with safety, or whether there was any way in which it could be made harmless. There were some mines, for instance, that contained within them a small vial partly filled with sulphuric acid. The mine carried no prongs, but if it were tilted more than 20 degrees, the acid would spill out and blow up the mine. Such a mine would be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to handle from a boat that was rocked about by the waves. After the first mine of the field was raised and its safety mechanism studied, the task of raising the rest was not so dangerous. A water telescope was used to locate the mine and to aid in hooking the hoisting cable into the shackle on the mine. The hook was screwed to the end of a pole, and after the mine was hooked, the pole was unscrewed and the cable hauled in, bringing up the devil's egg bristling with death. Care had to be taken to keep the bobbing boat from touching the delicate prongs until the safety device could be set. However, this painstaking and careful method of raising mines was not often employed. Shallow draft minesweepers would run over the mine field, dragging a cable between them. The cable would be kept down by means of hydrovanes, or water kites, deep enough to foul the anchor cables of the mines. The water kites were V-shaped structures that were connected to the cable in such a way that they would nose down as they were dragged through the water and carry the cable under. The action is just the reverse of a kite, which is set to nose up into the wind and carry the kite up when it is dragged through the air. By means of the cable, the anchor chain of the mine was caught, and then the mine with its anchor was dragged up. If the mine broke loose from its anchor, it could be exploded with a rifle shot if it did not automatically explode on fouling the cable. Floating mines. When England entered the war, she mined her harbors because, although she had the mastery of the sea, she had to guard against raids of enemy ships carried out in foggy and dark weather. But the mines were no protection against submarines. They would creep along the bottom under the mines. Then cable nets were stretched across the harbor channels to bar the submarines, But the U-boats were fitted with cutters which would tear through the nets, and it became necessary to use mines set at lower depths so that the submarine could not pass under them, and nets were furnished with bombs which would explode when fouled by submarines. In fact, mines were set adrift with nets stretched between them to trap submarines. Floating mines were also used by the Germans for the destruction of surface vessels, and these were usually set adrift in pairs, with a long cable connecting them, so that if a vessel ran into the cable the mines would be dragged in against its hull and blow it up. The laws of war require that floating mines be of such a design that they will become inoperative in a few hours. Otherwise they might drift about for weeks or months or years and be a constant menace to shipping. Sometimes anchored mines break away from their moorings and are carried around by ocean currents, or are blown about by the winds. A year after the Russo-Japanese War, a ship was blown up by striking a mine that had been torn from its anchorage and had drifted far from the field in which it was planted. No doubt there are hundreds of mines afloat in the Atlantic Ocean, which for many years to come will hold out the threat of sudden destruction to ocean vessels. For the Germans knew no laws of war and had no scruples against setting adrift mines that would remain alive until they were eaten up with rust. The chart on the next page shows the course of ocean currents in the North Atlantic as plotted out by the Prince of Monaco, from which it may be seen that German mines will probably make a complete circuit of the North Atlantic, drifting down the western coast of Europe, across the Atlantic, around the Azores, and into the Gulf Stream, which will carry them back to the North Sea, only to start all over. Some of them will run up into the Arctic Ocean, where they will be blown up by striking icebergs, and many will be trapped in the mass of floating seaweed in the Sargasso Sea. But many years will pass before all danger of mines will be removed. In the meantime, the war has left a tremendous amount of work to be done in raising anchored mines and destroying them. Egg-laying submarines. Early in the war the British were astonished to find enemy mine fields in their own waters, far from any German ports. They could not have been planted by surface mine layers, unless these had managed to creep up disguised as peaceful trawlers. This seemed hardly likely, because these fields appeared in places that were well guarded. Then it was discovered that German U-boats were doing this work. Special mine-laying U-boats had been built, and one of them was captured with its cargo of "devil's eggs." A sectional view of the mine-laying U-boat is shown opposite page 272. In the after part of the boat were mine chutes, in each of which 3 mines were stored. A mine-laying submarine would carry about a score of mines. These could be released one at a time. The mine with its anchor would drop to the bottom. As soon as it struck, anchor arms would be tripped and spread out to catch in the sand or mud, while the mine cable would be released and the mine would rise as far as the cable would allow it. The U-boat commander would have to know the depth of water in which the mines were to be laid, and adjust the cables to this depth in advance. This could not be done while the U-boat was submerged. With the mines all set for the depth at a certain spot, the U-boat commander had to find that very spot to lay its eggs. Otherwise they would either lie too deep to do any harm to shipping, or else they would reach up to the surface where they might be discovered by the Allied patrols. As he had to do his navigating blindly, by dead reckoning, it was very difficult for him to locate his mine fields properly. But the Germans did not have a monopoly on submarine mine laying. The British also laid mines by submarine within German harbors and channels, right under the guns of Heligoland, and many a U-boat was destroyed by such mines within its home waters. Paravanes. On the other hand, the Allies had a way of sailing right through fields of enemy mines with little danger. Our ships were equipped with paravanes, which are something like the water kites used by mine sweepers, and they are still used in the waters of the war zone. Paravanes are steel floats with torpedo-shaped bodies and a horizontal plane near the forward end. At the tail of the paravane there are horizontal and vertical rudders which can be set to make the device run out from the side of the vessel that is towing it and at the desired depth below the surface. 2 paravanes are used, one at each side of the ship, and the towing cables lead from the bow of the vessel. Thus there are 2 taut cables that run out from the ship in the form of a V, and at such a depth that they will foul the mooring cable of any mine that might be encountered. The mine cable slides along the paravane cable, and in this way is carried clear of the ship's hull. When it reaches the paravane it is caught in a sharp-toothed jaw, which cuts the mine cable and lets the mine bob up to the surface. The mine is then exploded by rifle or machine gun fire. In some forms of paravane there is a hinged jaw which is operated from the ship to shear the cable. The jaw is repeatedly opened and closed by a line that runs to a winch on the ship. This winch winds up the line until it is taut, and then the line is permitted to slip, letting the jaw open, only to close again as the winch keeps on turning and winding up the line. Guarded by steel sharks on each side, their jaws constantly working, a ship can plow right through a field of anchored mines with little danger. To be sure, the bow might chance to hit a mine, when of course there would be an explosion, but the ship could stand damage here better than anywhere else, and unless the bow actually hit the mine, one or other of the paravanes would take care of it and keep it from being dragged in against the hull of the vessel. Penning in the U-boats. According to German testimony, mines were responsible for the failure of the U-boat. However, it was not merely the scattered mine fields sown in German waters that brought the U-boat to terms, but an enormous mine field stretching across the North Sea from the Orkney Islands to the coast of Norway. Early in the war, U-boats had been prevented from entering the English Channel by nets and mines stretched across the Straits of Dover. As the submarine menace grew, it was urged that a similar net be stretched across the North Sea to pen the U-boats in. But it seemed like a stupendous task. The distance across at the narrowest point is nearly 250 miles. It would not have been necessary to have the net come to the surface. It could just as well have been anchored so that its upper edge would be covered with 30 feet of water. Surface vessels could then have sailed over it without trouble, and submarines could not have passed over it without showing themselves to patrolling destroyers. It would not have been necessary to carry the net to the bottom of the sea. A belt of netting 150 feet wide would have made an effective barrier to the passage of U-boats. As U-boats might cut their way through the net, it was proposed to mount bombs or mines on them, which would explode on contact and destroy any submarine that tried to pass. However, laying a net 200 feet long, even when it is laid in sections, is no small job, but when the net is loaded with contact mines, the difficulty of the work may be well imagined. And yet, had it been thought that the net would be a success, it would have been laid anyhow, but it was argued that seaweed would clog the meshes of the net and ocean currents would tear gaps in it. Even if it had not been torn away, the tidal currents would have swept it down and borne it under so far that U-boats would have passed over it in safety without coming to the surface. A wall of mines. When America entered the war, we were very insistent that something must be done to block the North Sea, and we proposed that a barrage of anchored mines be stretched across the sea, and that these mines be set at different levels so as to make a wall that submarines could not dive under. This would do away with all the drawbacks of a net. Ocean currents and masses of seaweed could not affect individual mines as they would a net. Furthermore, an American inventor had devised a new type of mine which was peculiarly adapted to the proposed mine barrage. It had a firing mechanism that was very sensitive, and the mine had twice the reach of any other. At length the British mine-laying forces were prevailed upon to join with us in laying this enormous mine. It was one of the biggest and most successful undertakings of the war. It was to be 230 miles long and 12 miles wide on the average, reaching from the rocky shores of the Orkney Islands to Norway. There was plenty of deep water close to the coast of Norway, and it was against international law to lay mines within 3 miles of the shores of a neutral nation, so that the U-boats might have had a clear passage around the end of the barrage. But as it was also against the law for the U-boats to sail through neutral waters, Norway laid a minefield off its coast to enforce neutrality. And this was to join with that which the British and we were to lay. Most of the mine laying was to be done by the United States, and we were to furnish the mines. The order to proceed with the work was given in October, 1917, and it was a big order. 100,000 mines were to be made, and to preserve secrecy, as well as to hurry the work as much as possible, it was divided among 500 contractors and subcontractors. The parts were put together in one plant and then sent to another, where each mine was filled with 300 pounds of molten TNT. To carry them across the ocean, small steamers were used, so that if one should be blown up by a submarine, the loss of mines would not be very great. There were 24 of these steamers, each carrying from 1,200 to 1,800 mines, and only one of them was destroyed by a submarine. The steamers delivered their loads to the west coast of Scotland, and the mines were taken across to the east coast by rail and motor canal boats. Here the mines were finally assembled, ready for planting. 70,000 mines were planted, 4/5 of them by American mine layers, and the rest by the British. Mine railroads on ships. To handle the mines, the ships were especially fitted with miniature railroads for transporting the mines to the launching point, so that they could be dropped at regular intervals without interruption. Each anchor mine was provided with flanged wheels that ran on rails. The mines were carried on 3 decks, and each deck was covered with a network of rails, switches, and turntables, while elevators were provided to carry the mines from one deck to another. The mines, like miniature railroad cars, were coupled up in trains of 30 or 40, and as each mine weighed 1,400 pounds, steam winches had to be used to haul them. At the launching point the tracks ran out over the stern of the boat, and here a trap was provided which would hold only one mine at a time. By the pulling of a lever, the jaws of the trap would open, and the mine would slide off the rails and plunge into the sea. The mines were dropped every 300 feet in lines 500 feet apart, as it was unsafe for the mine layers to steam any closer to one another than that. The mines were of the type shown in Figure 22, and automatically adjusted themselves to various depths. The depth of the water ran down to 1,200 feet near the Norwegian coast. Never before had mines been planted at anywhere near that depth. It was dangerous work, because the enemy knew where the mines were being planted, as neutral shipping had to be warned months in advance. The mine layers were in constant danger of submarine attack, although they were convoyed by destroyers to take care of the U-boats. There was even danger of a surface attack, and so battle cruisers were assigned the job of guarding the mine layers. The mine layers steamed in line abreast, and had one of them been blown up, the shock would probably have been enough to blow up the others as well. Enemy mines were sown in the path of the mine layers, so the latter had to be preceded by mine sweepers. Navigation buoys had to be planted at the ends of the lines of mines, and the enemy had a habit of planting mines near the buoys, or of moving the buoys whenever he had a chance. But despite all the risks, the work was carried through. The barrier was not an impassable one. With the mines 300 feet apart, a submarine might get through, even though the field was 25 miles broad. But the hazards were serious. Before the first lines of mine had been extended halfway across, its value was demonstrated by the destruction of several U-boats, and as the safety lane was narrowed down, the losses increased. It is said that altogether 23 German submarines met their doom in the great mine barrage. U-boat commanders balked at running through it, and U-boat warfare virtually came to a standstill. According to Captain Bartenbach, commander of submarine bases in Flanders, 3 U-boats were sunk by anchored mines for every one that was destroyed by a depth bomb. CHAPTER XV